Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the velvet curtained, gaslit world of Victorian London, not through the polished front doors of high society. Nope, we're ducking around the back alley, brushing past the clinking tavern doors, and slipping quietly into a place most history books like to skim over. Tonight, we're talking about what it was actually like to work in a Victorian brothel. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all lace fans and flirtatious giggles. In fact, you might not survive the first week unless you had a strong stomach, a sharp mind, and the patience to deal with a clientele that ranged from lonely poets to very confused bankers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is over there. I love seeing our sleepy little community from all over the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin at the beginning, or at least the beginning for a woman considering this line of work in Victorian England. There wasn't exactly a job board for brothel work. No neat little listing saying wanted, courtesan with charm, conversational skills, and a high tolerance for cheap cologne. For many, this wasn't a profession so much as a last resort. The industrial age had its marvels, sure, but for working class women, especially unmarried ones, the options were grim. Factory work, dangerous. Domestic service, exhausting and underpaid. Marriage, if you were lucky, and if you weren't, well, here we are. Some came by choice, though that word needs air quotes the size of Piccadilly Circus. Others were pushed by poverty, abandonment, or worse, and some were even recruited by madams who painted a very different picture than reality. Imagine being promised work as a seamstress, only to find out the stitching involved is of a very different kind. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Brothel worker in the Victorian era didn't mean just one thing. There was a whole social ladder. Believe it or not, at the very top, the courtesans, women who could recite poetry, speak French, and might dine with dukes. They lived in furnished flats, and occasionally had paintings made of them tasteful draped. Of course, at the very bottom were the so-called common girls, who worked from dismal rented rooms or street corners, often without protection, regulation, or even consistent payment. Brothels tried to sit somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, promising regular clients, safer environments, and at least a roof over your head. But safe is also a relative term. Many houses were barely legal, operating under the ever-watchful eye of the police, or rather, the occasional wink and nudge understanding that came with knowing who to bribe. Historians still debate how widespread these arrangements were, and some suggest that corruption ran all the way up to city officials. What's certain is that a woman stepping into this world was entering a complicated, often invisible network of power, money, and survival strategies. So what happened on day one? Well, if you were lucky, you'd be shown around by a slightly older worker with a sardonic sense of humor, someone who'd explain which chairs were for sitting and which were strictly decorative, and who the special customers were. If you were unlucky, you might be dropped into a shared room with no instruction except smile, and don't mention politics. The madam, of course, ran the place like a small kingdom. She held the purse strings, kept the books, and often doled out advice like a part-time therapist. Some madams had worked the floor themselves once upon a time. Others came from entirely different backgrounds. Rumor had it one of London's most infamous brothel owners was a retired opera singer who missed the applause. True, who knows, but the story stuck. One fun or bleak fact, in some houses, new girls had to pay up front for their room, wardrobe, and grooming supplies. That meant many started their career already in debt. It's like joining a gym, except the treadmill is emotional exhaustion, and the sauna is a drunk guy reciting keys badly. And still, some stayed for years. Why? Because despite the risks and hardships, this job gave something rare to many women of the era: cash in hand, autonomy, a locked door of their own, a strange kind of independence, even if it came at a steep price. So, our journey begins here in a sitting room that smells faintly of lavender, lamp oil, and old secrets. The wallpaper's peeling, the chandelier wobbles when the upstairs bed squeaks. But this is where some of the most forgotten stories of Victorian London unfolded. And tonight, we start listening. If you've made it past the velvet curtain and the madam's measuring stare, congrats, you've got the job. But now comes the next crucial decision: choosing where to work. Because in Victorian London, not all brothels were created equal. In the type of house you ended up in, that could change everything from how you dressed, to how you were treated, to whether or not you need to learn how to fake a fainting spell to get out of dinner with a dentist. There were, broadly speaking, three types of establishments: the high-class houses, the middling houses, and the common houses, and each came with its own set of expectations, perks, and peculiar problems. The high-class brothels, often called parlor houses or fashionable houses, were the ones whispered about behind fans at upper-crust parties. These places have velvet drapes, mahogany furniture, and possibly even a butler who pretended he didn't see what you were wearing. Clients were often well-to-do gentlemen, military officers, wealthy merchants, occasionally even minor nobility who had more money than sense. The women here were expected to maintain more than just a polished appearance. They had to know how to engage in conversation, quote Shakespeare, and occasionally identify obscure French cheeses. But it came at a price. Literally, you'd often be charged rent for your room, a fee for your outfits, and even deductions for things like excessive perfume usage. Some madams ran these places with the precision of a Swiss watch, keeping ledgers of every candle burned and every lace glove misplaced. And woe to the girl who showed up late to a scheduled appointment. You'd think being 5 minutes late to a tryst with a banker wouldn't be a crisis, but in some houses, it was grounds for suspension. Now, the middling houses were far more common. These catered to a mix of clients, clerks, traveling salesmen, off-duty soldiers. The decor was less velvet and more wallpaper, desperately trying to stay on the wall. The expectations were lower, but so were the margins. A good night's earnings might barely cover your keep, and the madams often took a generous cut, even for house maintenance, which mysteriously never improved. Still, many women preferred these places. Less pressure, fewer rules about how many forks to use at dinner, and usually a bit more camaraderie between workers. You might not get tipped with pearls, but you also didn't have to sit through a drunk lord talking about fox hunting for 2 hours. Then came the common houses, usually unlicensed, often hidden in slums or tucked above alehouses. These were the grimmest, bare-bones rooms, minimal sanitation, and customers who sometimes paid in buttons or yes. In some of these, the line between brothel and outright exploitation was dangerously thin. Many were run not by madams but by opportunistic landlords or worse, icons. In such places, choice was a luxury, safety even more so. Yet here's the thing: some women still opted for these houses. Why? Because sometimes they allowed more freedom. You could come and go, you weren't expected to act ladylike, and in rare cases, the absence of management meant the women formed informal co-ops, pooling earnings and watching each other's backs. Some historians still debate whether these arrangements were empowering or simply desperate adaptations. The truth, like much of history, probably lies somewhere in between. It's also worth noting that location mattered. A brothel in Soho had a very different clientele than one near the docks, and the farther from central London you went, the more likely the house also served other purposes and moonlighted as gambling dens. Others doubled as musical parlors. A few even offered fortune-telling, which often involved a suspiciously flirty tarot card reading. Choosing a house wasn't just about comfort or pay, it was about survival, reputation, and routine. Some women changed houses regularly, either by choice or by being let go. Others stayed in one place for years, building relationships with clients, finding a rhythm, carving out a strange sort of normalcy. And yes, word of mouth played a role. Brothels had reputations, some for their elegance, some for their discretion, some for the mysterious pie always available in the kitchen. Historians still have no idea why one particular house was known as the Plum Pudding Palace, but we're glad it was. One final oddity in certain elite brothels, New hires were introduced at small gatherings where clients could preview them. Like a grim version of speed dating with worse lighting. It's a deeply uncomfortable thought, but one that shows just how commodified these women's identities became. They weren't just selling time, they were selling persona, mystery, even myth. So, now that our young worker has chosen or landed in a particular house, the curtains are drawn, the lamps are lit, and the real business of the night is about to begin. Settling into a new brothel wasn't as simple as putting your things in a drawer and learning the creaky spots on the staircase. The first day, technically the first night, was its own little drama. Equal parts awkward debut and crash course in survival. Imagine being handed a corset, a scented handkerchief, and a schedule that starts at sundown and ends when the candles burn out, and no one actually explains the rules until you've broken 3 of them. Our new worker Lays called her Elsie for now, just to have someone to follow is shown to her room, which might generously feed a bed, a rickety washstand, and a mirror that gives slightly haunted vibes. The wallpaper peels in one corner, and someone, probably the last tenant, scratched a heart into the bedpost. There's a candle stub and a comb. That's about it. It's not much, but it's hers for now. One of the other girls, a seasoned veteran named Dora, with a knowing smirk and a fondness for sarcastic advice, gives her the lowdown. Don't wear red on Thursdays, it's Babel's color. And if Mr. Templeton comes in and asks if you read Byron, just nod and say yes. He doesn't know a thing about poetry anyway. This peer-to-peer onboarding was surprisingly common. While some madams did offer a house guy of sorts, usually verbal, rarely kind, most of the real know-how came from other workers. What not to say, how to angle your head in camlight to look mysterious instead of exhausted, which clients tipped, which talked too much, and which ones had specific expectations that might require creative improvisation. One man allegedly asked for an elaborate pirate-themed scenario involving 2 parrots and a fake treasure map. No further comment. Dressing up was often the first task, and no, not in lacy fantasy get-ups, at least not yet. The outfit of the day was dictated by house style, social level, and practicality. In some houses, each worker was expected to maintain their own wardrobe, complete with shoes, glove, and accessories. Others rented costumes, charging a daily fee. So yes, you might start your shift already in debt thanks to a frilly bonnet you didn't even choose. Now, if you're imagining Elsie standing glamorously at the top of a staircase, like a heroine in a slightly risque novel, pause the thought. The reality was much more routine, and occasionally a little absurd. First night, you might not even work. Some houses had a policy: observe first, participate second, a strange mix of initiation and silent judgment. Others threw new girls straight in, sometimes literally into a room where a paying customer waited with a drink in hand and a very uneven mustache. And yet, despite the nerves, many described that first night as a blur more than a trauma. Like any new job, there was fumbling, embarrassment, confusion. Maybe she spilled perfume on the wrong blouse. Maybe she said something awkward and made a client laugh at the wrong moment. Maybe Dora had to bail her out with a well-timed knock and a fake emergency involving a cat. One peculiar house custom: some brothels rang a small bell to mark the beginning of a session. Others knocked twice on the wall. One particularly dramatic place used a harp, cordas, a harp. A few even kept a strict logbook, listing the time, the room, and sometimes a vague client note like prefers whispers or no sudden laughter. These details were considered professional courtesy, though no one was really checking for historical accuracy. Interestingly, some historians have found records of new workers being tested not just on appearance or charm, but also on how well they could entertain, singing a verse of a popular song, telling a witty joke, even doing a bit of palm reading. The lines between entertainer and escort were often blurry, especially in houses that saw themselves as theatrical. There was even a house in Liverpool that reportedly had weekly talent nights. Yes, talent nights. Whether that meant actual talents or just highly creative flattery is still a matter of historical debate. And what of emotions? What did someone like Elsie feel after her first night? It depended. Relief, regret, a strange sense of control, maybe, or numbness. the kind you wrap around yourself like a shawl. There are scattered diary fragments and letters that suggest many women treated the job like theater, a performance to get through, a character to inhabit, a story that wasn't really them. Others leaned into the identity, seeing power in being desired, in navigating male fantasies for their own gain. But perhaps the most human thing of all, many simply wanted to make enough to send money home, to get a sister out of service, to save for a shop, to eventually leave, and that hoped possibility of a future beyond the parlor was sometimes the only thing that got them through the first terrifying, awkward, candlelit hours. Let's talk about routine, not the kind that involves sipping tea and doing yoga at sunrise, but the kind where your day starts when everyone else's ends. For a Victorian brothel worker like Elsie, normal had its own strange rhythm, a choreography of hairpins, candlelight, and a very strict schedule of who got the good mirror when. The working routine in most houses wasn't a free-for-all. It was structured, almost surprisingly so, depending on the size and formality of the brothel. The day, or rather, evening, began with preparations as early as 4 or 5 p.m. Why so early? Because getting ready took time, a lot of time, between bathing, styling hair, lacing corsets which required assistance, applying makeup, mostly white powder, rouge, and questionable eyeliner substitutes like soot or crushed berries, and choosing the least wrinkled gown from a shared wardrobe. 2 hours could pass before a single client showed up. Fun fact, in some brothels, there was an actual dressing order. Senior girls got first pick of the wardrobe with the most flattering gowns. Newcomers, they were left with whatever was still on the peg, which sometimes meant a missing button or a suspicious wine stain from last week's spirited poetry night. Makeup, by the way, wasn't always encouraged. In high-end houses, a natural look was prized, although ironically it took more effort. In cheaper houses, bold rouge and heavy scents were the norm. The perfume was not so much about allure as about survival, specifically masking the ambience. Let's just say indoor plumbing wasn't universal, and ventilation was considered optional. After the prep came the parlor hours, when workers were expected to be on display. Picture a drawing room with low gaslight, a dusty piano in the corner, and several women arranged in artful poses of casual interest, all while eyeing the front door like cats waiting for a mouse. It was part theater, part sales pitch, and part endurance test. Clients arrived usually between 7 and 10 p.m., though some houses stayed open till dawn. The clientele could be unpredictable, sometimes a flood, sometimes crickets. On slow nights, the girls might entertain themselves with gossip, card games, or taking turns pretending to be different types of customers just for laughs, apparently mimicking an overly romantic client named Mr. Thistlethwaite became a long-running inside joke at one house, where Mr. T had no idea. Now, once a client chose someone either by making a direct request or via a bizarrely formal notch, they'd be escorted to a room. Timing varied. Some houses allotted 30-minute sessions, others had more flexible arrangements. And no, there wasn't a punch clock, but there was a subtle expectation to not linger unless the client was tipping generously or if he fell asleep, which happened more often than you'd think. Between sessions, workers might return to the parlor, touch up their appearance, or retreat to their rooms if things were quiet. Eating during work hours was discouraged. In many houses it wasn't considered ladylike to nibble cheese toast in full costume. But hunger didn't care about etiquette. Some girls stashed snacks in creative places. There's at least one amusing report of a woman hiding a meat pie under a cushion, only to forget it until weeks later. The cushion was retired. Respectfully, breaks were rare. Some houses allowed them. Others expected workers to remain available unless ill. But here's the thing, it was a risky claim. Too many absences, and you might be dismissed. Some women faked cheerfulness through toothaches and fevers just to keep their place. Others learned tricks to sneak short naps sitting upright in a chair, fan in hand, pretending to be deep in thought. One of the most oddly touching aspects of the routine, the end-of-night rituals. After the last client left, the candles were snuffed, corsets unhooked, and makeup wiped away with cold cream and size. Some houses had shared tea before bed. Others just collapsed into sleep. A few had the habit of leaving little notes for one another jokes, warnings, or just a kind word. What's your hem? Floorboards loose. Mrs. Elkins is in a mood. Tread carefully. Or simply, you looked lovely tonight. Historians still argue whether these routines gave a sense of order or were just another form of control. One thing's for sure for women like Elsie, routine was a double-edged sword. It provided structure, yes, but also little room to breathe. And yet, within this structured chaos, there was camaraderie, coping mechanisms, and even moments of absurd hilarity, like the time a client tried to pay with a chicken. No, really, a live one. It escaped. The kitchen never recovered. All in a night's work. Now let's talk about the real armor of the trade, clothes. Because while Victorian brothel workers weren't wearing literal suits of chainmail, after spending an hour trying to lace up a corset, you'd be forgiven for thinking otherwise. Getting dressed wasn't just a matter of style, it was strategy, presentation, and sometimes even survival. The right outfit could make or break a night's earnings. The wrong one might get you ignored, ridiculed, or worse, assigned the client with the wandering hands and no sense of personal space. To begin with, most brothel workers didn't actually own their own wardrobes. In higher-end houses, clothes were often provided by the madam alone, of course, with a deduction from the night's pay to cover maintenance, which mysteriously never seemed to result in new buttons or clean hems. In middling or common houses, the women either brought what they had, bought second to hand, or swapped the items between themselves in a kind of unofficial communal closet system. Corsets were a must, not optional, and not just for shaping the body into the desired hourglass, but also because, well, they looked expensive, and looking expensive gave the delusion of being worth more. Never mind that breathing deeply was a challenge, and eating anything more substantial than a biscuit was a gamble. Want to seduce someone with your wit while your lungs are being gently crushed? Welcome to the club? Then there were the layers: chemise, corset, petticoat, overskirt, stockings, garters, glove, and sometimes another petticoat. Because volume was in, depending on the house style, you might be told to dress like a refined lady, a French actress, or in at least one weird case documented in a surviving brothel inventory like a mythical woodland nymph. We still don't know what that costume involved, but we hope it wasn't itchy. The color of your outfit mattered, too. Red was considered bold, blue was approachable, black, ironically, was sometimes reserved for the most exclusive client, sort of a sexy widow look, minus the actual grief. Some houses coordinated their workers like a very strange bouquet, everyone in a different shade, to give clients variety at a glance. Others let women choose their colors based on seniority or mood. It wasn't uncommon to hear things like, "Don't take the green sash tonight. Claire's trying to look mysterious." Accessories were another battlefield. A good necklace could earn you compliments all night. A broken earring could cost you a client. Many women learned small hacks, like pinning fabric to fake volume, or using lamp soot to darken lashes. Some got creative. There's one recorded case of a brothel worker using beet juice as lipstick, and another who lined her eyes with crushed violet petals. Historians disagree on how widespread these DIY beauty tricks were, but we do know Victorian makeup was complicated. Lead powder, yes. Mercury-based skin lighteners, also yes. Poison for beauty, apparently. It was just another occupational hazard. Let's not forget the shoes. High heels existed, but they were more like modest lifts than the sky-high stilettos we think of today. Practicality won out after all. You had to walk up narrow stairs in the dark and look graceful doing it. That's a lot to ask of a shoe that squeaks. And oh, the wigs, especially in higher-end houses. Wigs were used liberally, sometimes to create uniformity, sometimes to hide hair that had been singed by too many candle flames. Blonde wigs were especially popular, partly because they stood out in low light. There's a note from a 19th century London house that kept 3 blondes on rotational wig, none actually blonde. Underneath it all, quite literally, was the pressure to be desirable but not vulgar, flirtatious but not forward, stylish but not trying too hard. It was a constant balancing act. Too much rouge and you were cheap, too little and you were plain. This, despite the fact that men often couldn't tell the difference. and usually cared more about whether you laughed at their jokes. One of the most absurd aspects, some houses held dress inspections. The madam would walk through the parlor, checking for wrinkled skirts, smudged powder, or scandal sunshine boots. Get flagged, and you might be benched for the evening. No clients, no income. Of course, not every woman dressed to impress. Some leaned into a different strategy. Comfort. One brothel worker reportedly developed a signature look: bare feet, loosely tied robe, and a crown of fake daisies. Clients found it artistic. She found it breathable. Win-win. Fashion, for these women, wasn't about frivolity. It was armor. It was branding. It was the difference between a good night and a hungry one. And yet, under all the silk and sequins and coarsery, there was still a human being doing a difficult job, trying to keep her head up, her dress clean, and her sense of humor intact. If you thought the outfits were complicated, just wait until you meet the clients, because let's be honest, the clientele in a Victorian brothel could range from polite and vaguely poetic to honestly, "How did you tie your shoes this morning?" For women like Elsie, navigating these interactions was a full-time job in itself on that required emotional intelligence, improvisational talent, and an almost superhuman ability to pretend to enjoy listening to a man explain the corn laws for the third time in a week. Clients came from all walks of life, contrary to the stereotype that only society's bottom rung frequented brothels. A surprising number of customers were quite respectable by day. There were bankers, clergymen, yes, really, lawyers, newspaper editors, traveling merchants, and a fair share of the bored and privileged upper class. Some were first-timers, others were regulars with favorite girls, favorite rooms, and even favorite excuses for being out late. Each came with their own quirks and expectations. Some wanted conversation hours of it. One gentleman, according to an old brothel ledger, booked weekly sessions just to be read from Sir Walter Scott. Others were awkward, painfully shy, and barely said a word. And then there were the talkersmen who mistook the setting for a confessional booth and spilled everything from business secrets to midlife crises. As one woman reportedly said, "He paid for an hour. I earned it in silence." Of course, not all clients were gentlemen, at least not in behavior. Some were rough, rude, or simply unwashed. In common houses, workers had little say in whom they saw if you were assigned to someone. That was it. In better houses, there was occasionally a right of refusal, though using it too often could get you labeled difficult. So many learned to adapt, to smile, to steer the interaction subtly, and sometimes to excuse themselves for powder and simply never come back. One very particular client reportedly insisted that all conversation during his visits be conducted in rhyming couplets. Another brought his own slippers and asked to be called Captain Pickles. These stories sound absurd, but they show the range and, let's be honest, the ridiculousness of human desire. Some women preferred the talkers to the touchers. Some liked older clients who simply wanted affection and quiet company. Others dreaded the young ones, who tried to impress with bad poetry or worse kissing. And then there were the heartbreakers clients who genuinely seemed kind, perhaps even affectionate, but who always left before dawn and never stayed long enough to ask your real name. And names mattered. Most women didn't use their real ones. Elsie might be Leah on Tuesdays and Pearl on weekends. Clients often asked for specific names again and again, unaware or uninterested that the girl behind the name had changed. One popular alias was Dolly. At one point, 3 different Dollys worked under the same roof, each with their own set of admirers. It was a brand. Really? Now, we should take a moment here to say, not every client encounter ended in the bedroom. In many cases, that even involved only conversation, a bit of flirtation, maybe some music. In high-end brothels, clients were offered brandy, cigars, and sometimes a small concert before anything remotely intimate occurred. It was, oddly, like a salon with corsets and coy glances. Some men simply wanted company. Some were lonely. Some just needed someone to pretend they were funny. Historians still debate the psychological dynamics of these relationships. Were they exploitative, performative, emotional transactions, or something more complex? There's no single answer. Some women formed strange, lasting bonds with repeat clients. Others saw every face as a transaction, a number on a page, a story to forget. There's one rather touching story, possibly apocryphal, of a client who visited the same woman every week for 5 years, never once requesting intimacy. He brought her books, asked about her cat, and once gifted her a telescope because she mentioned she liked the stars. No one knows what became of them. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe she was, too. Then there were the clients, who came and went without ever saying a real word, just nods, gestures, a pressed coin into a gloved hand. In these cases, a woman learned to read body language like a second script. A shift in posture, a furrowed brow, a change in cologne all meant something. The worst clients, the ones who thought payment meant ownership, who believed they could insult, humiliate, or control without consequence. Some madams protected their girls from this. Others didn't. In houses where the balance of power tilted too far, nights could feel like battles in a war that no one admitted was happening. Still, somehow, the women made it work. They laughed about the oddballs. They shared stories behind closed doors. Did you get the one who thinks he's a French count? No, but I had the foot fetishist with a lisp again. And they moved on, because in the end, clients were part of the job, not the whole story. Just another piece of the strange, glittery, exhausting puzzle of a life lived in lamplight and borrowed names. At this point, you might be thinking, surely there weren't rules in brothels. Right, I mean, it's not exactly Sunday school. But oh, my dear sleepy listener, there were so many rules. In fact, the brothel world was often more strictly governed than a boarding school for overly dramatic Victorian poets. And breaking those rules, that could get you fined, benched, or booted out into the fog with only your corset and a well-worn pair of shoes. Let's start with the basics. Every house had its own rule book, sometimes written down, sometimes just passed along by hushed warnings and side-eyes from more experienced girls. These rules covered everything from work schedules to table manners to how loud your laughter was allowed to be. Yes, seriously, one infamous house in Manchester had a no-shrieking rule because the madam said it frightened the clients. At the core of most rule systems was control over behavior, over routine, and over the illusion of refinement. Even in the humblest house, madams expected their workers to maintain a certain poise. That meant no chewing loudly, no slouching, and absolutely no discussing your real life with clients. You were supposed to be a fantasy, not a woman with rendo, a toothache, or an annoying younger brother who kept asking for free pocket money. One very common rule: no falling in love with clients. It sounds cliche, but this was considered a serious offense. Why? Because romantic entanglements messed with business. A girl might start giving freebies, or worse, she might run off. And believe it or not, some actually did. There are stories of women being smuggled out in laundry carts, or disappearing after a midnight rendezvous with a particularly persuasive baker, because apparently bread and flattery are powerful. Now, some houses had quirkier rules. For example, no eating onions before 6 p.m. Halitosis ruins the mood. Apparently, no bare feet in the parlor. Even if your heels are killing you, never talk about Queen Victoria unless asked. She was not a hot topic, and in a few rare cases, girls had to wear bells, small ones, sewn into the hems of their gowns. Why? The madam said it added a musical quality to movement. The girls said it made them feel like decorative livestock. The bells eventually disappeared, probably accidentally, into the fireplace. One rather touching rule, oddly enough, was the tea clause in a few gendered houses between midnight and 1 a.m. The girls were allowed to gather in the kitchen for tea and toast, free from clients, no costumes, no small talk, just steaming mugs and a moment of peace. It's one of those things you don't expect, tucked into such a transactional world, an echo of normalcy, maybe even care. There were, of course, rules about hygiene, though were counted as hygienic varied wildly. Some houses required daily foot soaks. Others had perfume hour, where each girl was expected to dab herself with a house scent, lavender and something vaguely citrusy thing, gold furniture polish with ambition, and nearly every house banned sickness. If you had a cough or a rash, You were expected to keep quiet or risk being let go, because if clients got spooked, business dropped, and if business dropped, everyone felt it. Ma'ams ran the show, and their word was law. Some were ex-workers themselves and ran tight but fair operations. Others were more like theatrical directors with a flair for drama. One reportedly began every shift with a speech and an inspection, like a general preparing for battle. Straighten your backs, check your seams, and remember you are ladies of the night, not lampshades, she once said. We're still unpacking that metaphor and enforcement that ranged from fine size, actual monetary penalties to passive-aggressive notes slipped under your door. In one famous case, a madam implemented a 3 strikes policy involving a literal chalkboard in the parlor. Each offense earned you a tally mark, 3 marks, and you were on dish duty for a week, which, in a brothel, was somehow worse than your regular job. Of course, the rules weren't always followed. Workers broke curfews, smuggled in outside snacks, whispered about clients, and occasionally staged silent rebellions, like rearranging the furniture slightly, just to mess with the madam's aesthetic flow. These quiet rebellions were a form of resistance, tiny expressions of agency in a system designed to keep women manageable, predictable, pleasing. Some rules protected them, others boxed them in, and many of the women walked a constant tightrope. Follow the rules too strictly, and you lose your spirit. Break them too often, and you lose your place. Still, within all the regulation and routine, there were moments of levity. A misbuttoned blouse, a client who mistook rouge for sunburn, a wink from Doro when the madam wasn't looking, because even behind all the rules, these were just women laughing, coping, surviving on ridiculous restriction at a time. Now, let's tiptoe into a part of this world that's usually swept under the parlor rug. Health, not the glamorous kind that comes from a good night's sleep and leafy greens, but the kind brothel workers in Victorian London had to constantly manage while surviving a job that demanded physical energy, emotional stamina, and an immune system of steel. First things first, public health was a mess. In the mid-19th century, London was still learning what germs were. Sewer systems were patchy. Clean water was a luxury, and antibiotics were science fiction. So for women like Elsie, working in close quarters, with a rotating cast of gentlemen and only occasional access to soap, hygiene wasn't a footnote, it was a battlefield. Most brothels had basic wash basins in their rooms, but what counted as clean depended on the house. In better establishments, there might be a weekly bath schedule with heated water, and if you were lucky, actual soap made from something other than rendered mystery fat. In lower-tier houses, a shared basin and a prayer. One brothel reportedly had a single bar of soap chained to the wall, symbolic and slippery. Illness, of course, was a constant concern. The Victorian era was full of diseases that sounded like villains in a Gothic novel: consumption, tuberculosis, ague malaria, the clap gonorrhea, and the ever-mysterious female hysteria, which was really just a catch-all for anything that made women inconvenient. Sexually transmitted infections were rampant and poorly understood. Syphilis was the big one. Early stages could be mistaken for a rash or fatigue. Later stages could lead to neurological damage. Treatments ranged from the mildly ineffective herbal teas to the deeply questionable mercury rubs and arsenic peels. And yes, many women endured these treatments because they were told by madams or apothecaries that a little poison keeps the bad humors in check. Spoiler, it did not. To monitor these issues, at least in theory, the government instituted something called the Contagious Diseases Act in the 1860s. Under this law, women suspected of being prostitutes could be forcibly examined by police-assigned doctors. If found unclean, they could be detained in special hospitals for up to 3 months. No trial, no appeal, just suspicion and a speculum. The idea, supposedly, was to protect the health of men, especially soldiers. Though women, they were collateral damage. Unsurprisingly, this led to public outcry. Feminists like Josephine Butler led campaigns to repeal the acts, arguing that the system was invasive, unjust, and hypocritical. After years of protest, the laws were finally repealed in 1886, but the damage to bodies and dignity lingered much longer. In private, Women looked after each other's health as best they could. If someone had a persistent cough or developed a fever, other girls might share herbal remedies, stolen rest, or whispered tips from old wives' tales. Lavender for nerves, vinegar baths to clean the blood, garlic necklaces, because, well, why not? And then there were the remedies sold by street peddlers, miracle powders, mystery tonics, elixirs for lay troubles. Some were harmless, some were just sugar and chalk, and some pure alcohol with a splash of opium. Effective, sure. Wise, debatable. Pregnancy, of course, was the most pressing health concern. Contraceptives were unreliable and stigmatized. Some women used homemade methods, sponges soaked in vinegar, or more unusual items we won't describe before bed. Abortions were illegal and dangerous, often performed in secret by midwives or unlicensed practitioners. Some survived, some didn't, but not everything was bleak. Some houses had basic first aid practices. If you fell ill, a girl like Dora might bring you broth, tell the man you were resting your voice, and cover your shift. Women formed small, informal networks of quiet, fierce, deeply human. There's a half-forgotten letter from a woman named Nellie, who wrote to a friend in another city. I keep rosemary on the windowsill and rub it on my wrists each morning. Dora says it smells better than gin and scares away the bad spirits. I think she means clients. Was it medical advice? Not exactly, but it tells you something about how women survived not just physically, but emotionally. In a world that didn't protect them, they built little rituals of safety for themselves. Scented oils, warm socks, laughter in the stairwell, a superstition about never starting a shift on a Tuesday. Modern historians still debate how much access brothel workers had to real medical care. Some say high-end houses had doctors on call. Others argued that visits were rare and only for emergencies. Most likely, it varied by house, by income, by luck. But one thing is certain. These women endured. They patched themselves up. They helped each other. They got up the next night and the one after, powdered their faces, tied their laces, and walked out into the parlor like nothing was wrong. Because in the end, survival wasn't a chapter, it was the whole story. Let's take a moment to peek behind the curtain literally and talk about off-duty life in a Victorian brothel. Because as strange as it sounds, there was such a thing. When the gaslights dimmed, and the last echo of awkward flirting faded down the hallway, the women who worked these houses had a sliver of time that was all their own. What they did with it, well, that varied wildly. First off, forget the idea that everyone just flopped onto a bed and passed out. Sure, exhaustion was real after hours in corsets and small talk. Many did just that, but others had post-shift rituals. Elsie, for example, might sit by the window with a chipped mug of tea, watching the fog roll in over the gaslit streets. Dora might untie her hair and sing softly while brushing its own 100 strokes, not because it helped, but because it gave her something to count besides regrets. Some women read, contrary to popular myths. Many brothel workers were surprisingly literate. Some had been governesses, seamstresses, even clerks before ending up in the trade. In their downtime, they devoured penny novels, romance serials, even the occasional book of poetry. There's a recorded case of a whole house sharing one copy of Jane Eyre, each taking turns reading aloud by candlelight. Apparently, everyone agreed that Rochester was a bit much. Others kept journals, though few survived. Those that did offer quiet, poignant insight into lives lived under constant performance. One reads, "Today a man asked me what I would be if I were not here. I said a lighthouse. He left, but I meant it." There were games, too. Card games were popularist, cribbage, or a rowdy version of Old Maid, where the loser had to clean the common wash basin. Sometimes, the girls held mock elections, most likely to retire rich, best at fake laughing, least likely to remember a client's name. These titles were silly, sure, but also a little rebellious in the acts of self-definition in a world they constantly tried to define them. Music was another escape. Houses with pianos saw informal concerts late at night. Someone might clink out a tune, another hum along. Sometimes a client left behind sheet music, and the girls would puzzle through it, turning the parlor into an impromptu rehearsal room. It didn't matter how good they were. It wasn't about applause, it was about noise that didn't require seduction. Food was complicated. Most brothels provided meals, but they weren't exactly chef-curated. Stew, bread, tea, basic, cheap, and filling. But if one of the girls had family nearby, they might sneak in little luxuries: pickled eggs, a tin of jam, slices of buttered toast wrapped in cloth. These treats were shared like gold. Nothing built loyalty like offering someone your last biscuit after a long shift. Sleep, of course, was elusive, not just because of the odd hours or the creaky beds, but because relaxing after pretending to be someone else all night is harder than it sounds. Some couldn't sleep without the muffled background hum of voices in the parlor. Others needed silence so absolute you could hear the mouse behind the wall second to guessing its life choices. But perhaps the most interesting part of off-duty life, friendships. Real, messy, supportive, occasionally gossipy friendships. These women lived together, worked together, and saw each other at their best and worst. They braided each other's hair, patched each other's skirts, shared hot water, secrets, and occasionally clients who were in a weird mood tonight. Would you just take this one, please? Were there arguments? Of course. Jealousy, stolen ribbons, accusations of skid shifts. But in many houses, the camaraderie ran deep. It had to. The job was isolating. The world outside judged them. Inside, at least, there was understanding. You didn't have to explain why you were tired or why you cried at the sight of a child walking by the window. They got it. There's a note from a police record of all place that describes a brothel where one woman died unexpectedly from illness. The others pooled their earnings to bury her properly. They dressed her themselves. They wrote a small poem and placed it under her pillow. No one asked them to. They just did. And that, more than anything, gives you a sense of the off-duty hours. Because it wasn't just tea and novels. It was grief, laughter, whispers under blankets. A joke told twice because the first time someone didn't hear it. It was women making space for themselves in the margins of a job that gave them almost none. These hours didn't show up in the ledger books or the medical inspections. They weren't captured in scandalous reports or gossip columns, but they mattered. They were where identity was rebuilt, quietly, under low lamplight, where Elsie stopped being whoever the client wanted and became, for a little while, just Elsie again. Now that we've seen the routines and the rules, let's slide into something a bit more atmospheric: brothel itself. Because the building, the space, the layout of where women like Elsie lived and worked well, that mattered more than you might think. And no, not all brothels looked like red velvet lounges with chandeliers and pianos that play themselves whenever something scandalous is said. Some were modest townhouses, others were downright shabby, a few strangely cozy. Let's start with the fancy ones, what were known as parlor houses. These were the high-end establishments, often located in relatively nice neighborhoods. You walk past and maybe never suspect what was going on inside, except for a subtle curtain fluttering or the slightly too friendly doorman. Inside, there might be oil paintings on the wall, faux gilded mirrors, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a Jane Austen adaptation if Jane Austen had a slightly racier side hustle. The parlor itself was the centerpiece. This was the stage. It was where the girls Saturday in arranged positions, dressed to the nines, pretending not to care who walked in while secretly clocking every twitch of the front door. A piano in the corner, gas lamps flickering just enough to soften imperfections, and maybe a dog-eared book of poetry on the side table to suggest an air of sophistication. Then came the working room, search one decorated according to theme or vibe. The Oriental room, the hunting lodge, the French salon. It was part fantasy, part furniture store showroom. In wealthier brothels, beds had proper mattresses and actual linens. In others, well, you might not want to sit down without checking twice. But most women didn't work in palaces. The average brothel was a repurposed boarding house or terraced home, modest in structure, creatively modified. Bedrooms upstairs, parlor and kitchen below. The walls, thin, the furniture, frequently second to hand. The curtains, usually doing more decorative work than actual blocking of eyes work. In many of these spaces, Women shared rooms. Privacy was a luxury. You might have your own bed maybe, your own drawer hopefully, and a hook on the wall for your dresses, and that was it. Personal touches were small but meaningful. A handkerchief from a favorite client, a pressed flower in a book, a single mismatched earring that belonged to no one but was considered lucky. Some houses had odd layouts like the one in East London, where the back staircase was only wide enough for one person at a time. This created traffic jams so awkward that girls developed a system of knocking 3 times before starting their descent, just to avoid running into each other mid-corset. Bathrooms, where most brothels had chamber pots or communal outhouses, often in the backyard, and don't even ask about plumbing in the winter. One woman described it as like wrestling with a porcelain ghost in the freezing dark. Romantic, the kitchens varied. Some were bustling, full of chatter and boiling kettles. Others were tiny and tucked away, used only to make basic meals or warm up soup from a tin. But many women found ways to carve a little comfort into Cynthia tins, labeled in neat handwriting, jars of jam with other people's names scratched out and new ones written in. Interestingly, brothels also had business zones, ledgers, accounts, client lists, house rules pinned to a corkboard or tucked in a drawer. Madam's office might be a curtained corner in the parlor or a separate room entirely. There, she kept records, tracked debts, and occasionally settled disputes with the diplomacy of a small-town mayor and the firmness of a prison warden. And then there was the front door. That door wasn't just a door. It was the line between two worlds. On one side, the gaslit chaos of Victorian London. On the other, a space where women played roles, earned wages, and tried to keep their sanity intact. Some clients entered with a swagger. Others hesitated, some knocked gently, as if unsure whether they were seeking affection or penance. Behind that door, time passed differently. It was always half past something. Too early, too late, never quite now. Historians often focus on the economic and moral debates surrounding sex work in this era, but they sometimes forget the architecture of survival's real, physical spaces where women lived their entire emotional landscape. The creak of the stairwell, the chip tile in the hallway, the soft hiss of a kettle warming on the stove at 3 a.m. One letter from the time describes a room so small I could touch both walls at once, but I liked it better than any I've had because the window faced the morning. That's the kind of detail we never get in the grand historical narratives, but it matters because sometimes it's not the chandelier in the parlor that tells the truth. It's the scarf tucked under a pillow, the dent in the wallpaper where someone leaned their head too often, the silence after laughter. These brothels weren't just businesses, they were makeshift homes, imperfect, precarious, and often painful but still filled with traces of lives being lived. One parlor bell and midnight curtain twitch at a time. Let's shift our gaze now not to the brothel, but to the neighborhood around it, because while the inside was a world of perfume and parlor games, the outside was often far less forgiving. And for Victorian brothel workers, the street wasn't just a place to get from A to B. It was a stage, a trap, a rumor mill, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a place to buy tea strong enough to wake the dead. Most brothels were located in what were politely called mixed districts. That's Victorian speak for everything, from cobblers to coffin makers to questionable cigar shops, all crammed together on one soot-covered street. You walked past a butcher, a pawnbroker, a chapel, and a house of ill repute before breakfast. It was urban collage at its finest. For the women, stepping out of the brothel meant stepping into a performance. Even in daylight, they were watched by neighbors, by church ladies, by bored children with too much time and not enough supervision. Some stared, others whispered, and once in a while, someone would shout something crude from across the street. But for the most part, people just looked like you were a curiosity that didn't quite feed into their respectable narrative. To manage this, many brothel workers developed what we might call their street selves. Different clothes, a quieter walk, a face like they were thinking about something very important and definitely not your business. Some houses required women to wear modest coats over their working clothes when stepping outside. Others suggested walking impairs strength in numbers and less likely to attract the wrong kind of attention. But there was another layer to street life. The routine. Most women had errands, visits to the apothecary, trips to the laundress, quiet moments buying second-hand books or mending ribbon in the back of a millinery shop. You had to be clever. Too, some businesses refused service, so you learned at which shops looked the other way. Elsie knew the fishmonger's assistant would give you an extra fillet if you complimented as sideburns. Doris where the baker gave better bread if you pretended to be a widow, a very hungry widow. Some streets were surprisingly tolerant. In parts of London, like Soho or Covent Garden, brothels had been part of the landscape for decades. Locals might roll their eyes, but they wouldn't clutch their pearls every time someone in red velvet walked past. Other areas, especially where reformist groups were active, were more hostile. Coasters would go up overnight. Mothers, guard your sons, or sin walks among us. One woman wrote that someone once threw a Bible at her, not to her, at her. And then there were the constables. Some were indifferent, some were aggressive, a few were friendly. Bribes were common, a coin here, a wink there. If you got on a certain officer's good side, he might warn you of a raid, or turn a blind eye to late-night noise. If you didn't, well, hope your boots were good for running, but it wasn't all tension and shadows. The streets held moments of sweetness, too. The flower seller who left an extra violet in your basket. The neighbor who pretended not to hear the piano at midnight. The old man at the corner who nodded respectfully every morning without saying a word. And the women weren't passive either. They formed alliances, shared warnings, watched out for each other. If a girl didn't return from an errand, the others noticed. If someone was being followed, there were signals like adjusting your bonnet twice, or walking a specific path that would bring you past familiar faces. Even the children on the street played a role. Some ran errands for the brothel and were paid in sweets or spare coins. Others became informants. The policeman's coming, they'd say, before disappearing into an alley with all the gravity of a spy. Some historians debate whether this informal community protection was deliberate or just coincidental. But one thing's for sure, brothel workers rarely walked alone in spirit. Nighttime, thought hat was a different story. When the lamps flickered on and the fog settled low, the city changed. It became quieter, yes, but also stranger. The creak of a cart, the whistle of a trunk, the sound of boots on cobblestones, everything took on a sharper edge. Walking outside at night meant risk. Clients waiting in the wrong place. Policemen looking for arrests. Strangers who didn't knock first. So the women stayed indoors when they could, looked out windows, watched the world turn without them, and occasionally dreamed of living in a house where no one watched them come and go. Still, the streets weren't just setting, they were part of the story. They shaped reputations. They carried rumors. They remembered the click of certain heels, the sway of a familiar skirt, the silhouette of someone who had learned to walk in confidence, no matter what anyone thought. Because even on streets that never fully accepted them, women like Elsie carved out space on step, one nod, one quietly defined shopping trip at a time. Let's pause for a moment and talk about something that rarely makes it into the dusty history books. Dreams of these women. Not the kind you have after too much cheese and a long shift, but the big, secret, stubborn dreams they carried with them like a coin sewn into a petticoat hem. Because yes, amid all the routines, rules, and restrictions, there were still hopes. Sometimes quiet, sometimes wildly unrealistic, but always there. You see, no one started out wanting to end up in a brothel. That's not exactly the top of anyone's childhood aspiration list. Even in an era when being a chimney sweep or match girl was considered a solid plan B. For many, sex work was a stopgap meant to be temporary, a means to an end, a season, not a sentence. So what did they dream of? For some, it was financial independence, a little savings account under a fake name at the post office, enough to eventually open a dress shop or a bakery or a tea stall near the docks, where people didn't ask too many questions. These were the pragmatic dreamers. They kept ledgers, cut corners, and had coins in hollowed-out books. You'd be surprised how many copies of Wuthering Heights in brothel bedrooms rattled suspiciously. Others dreamed of travel, of sailing to America or Australia, of starting fresh where no one knew their name or their past. With a specific squeak their boots made on the third step, they read about faraway lands in the paper and imagine what it would be like to walk down a street where no one looked twice. One woman reportedly saved for 2 years just to move to a town 50 miles away and pretend to be a widow. The dream wasn't distancy, it was freedom. Some held on to love old-fashioned kind, not the kind you barter by the hour. If you believed that one of their regulars might take them away, marry them, give them a home with a garden and curtains that didn't have to be drawn at all hours. And, yes, it did happen sometimes. Rarely, usually massively, but often enough to keep the idea flickering. Historians debate whether those matches were happy. The truth, probably the same ratio as everyone else's. But many dreams were smaller, softer, more private. Elsie wanted to own a rocking chair, one of the good ones, with a smooth finish and the arms curved just right. Dora wanted to go one day without anyone calling her by the wrong name. Another girl collected clippings from theater advertisements, not because she liked the plays, but because she liked the fonts. They dreamed of things we all do. A room of their own, a Sunday morning with no obligations, the luxury of boredom. Of course, not every dream survived. Some dimmed under the weight of routine. Others were folded up neatly and placed in the back of a drawer, waiting for some day. But still they were there. Some women wrote them down. Lists, letters never sent. One surviving scrap from a boarding house reads, "Learn to swim. Eat strawberries from a bowl, not a tin. Go to the seaside and scream into the wind." A historian once found a pressed daisy in a copy of The Lady's Companion at a former brothel site. No explanation. Just the flower, flattened and kept like a bookmark for something that might never be written. And here's something important. Even those who stayed in the trade for years, those who didn't escape or retire early or run off with a client, they still had dreams. You don't need to leave a place to imagine another version of yourself. Some tried to climb within this system, becoming housekeepers, then madams, owning their own houses, setting their own rules. They built little empires, managed women fairly, and even gave discounted rates to men who said please. One famous madam in Liverpool reportedly paid for 3 of her girls to attend night classes. That's right, education and hourly rates under the same roof. Victorian life, endlessly surprising. There's even evidence that a few women used their experience to become writers, secret advisors, or semi-respected consultants to reform groups. They knew the system inside out, and eventually, some turned that knowledge into leverage. But for most, the dream was simpler: to stop pretending to be themselves as Lily or Ruby, or miss something with a laugh practiced in the mirror, but just themselves. And here's where the heart of this section really lies. No matter what role society cast them in, these women imagined themselves beyond it, not as symbols, not as cautionary tales, but as people with preferences, annoyances, favorite colors, songs they hummed to themselves when no one else was around. They weren't just surviving, they were planning, hoping, even if it was just for a better pillow, or a quieter room, or a morning where someone brought them tea for once. Because dreams, as we all know, don't care where you sleep at night. They show up anyway. In the middle of the noise, under the gaslight, right there in the second-hand boots and borrowed names. Now, let's turn our attention to someone we've danced around this whole time. The clients. Yes, gentlemen callers, the paying guests. They said his name was Mr. Smith, but he looked more like a Jeffrey. These were the men who made the brothel business possible, for better or worse. And no, they weren't all top-hatted villains or mustachioed perverts with a pocket watch fetish. Oh, to be fair, a few absolutely were. The clientele of a Victorian brothel was remarkably diverse. Some were wealthy, some were barely scraping by, some were charming, others had the emotional depth of a teaspoon, but all of them walked through the same door with one thing in common: They were looking for something they couldn't or wouldn't find elsewhere. Let's start with the regulars. Every brothel had them. The man who came every Tuesday at precisely 7. The one who always asked for Dora but never remembered her name. The one who tipped well if you complimented his cane. These men treated their visits like going to the barber. Predictable, transactional, and oddly comforting. Then there were the awkward ones, shy, nervous, sweating through their waistcoats. They might ask how your day was. They might apologize during. One girl reportedly had a client who insisted on reading her a poem before anything else. It wasn't a good poem, but she said it was her favorite part of the week. Others were less pleasant. The entitled ones, the critics, the ones who thought paying a fee bought them ownership, not just time. These were the men you steeled yourself for, the ones who reminded you why rules existed and why sisters like Dora were so important. One sharp look from across the room, and you knew she'd step in if things went south. There were also the lonely ones, men who didn't necessarily want intimacy, but presence, companionship, someone to sit across from them and nod while they talked about their dog, or their late wife, or how they never got promoted at the office because of politics. One girl kept a small book of client stories in the scandalous parts, but they said once she called it the men who wanted tea. And of course, there were the oddballs, the man who insisted on bringing his parrot, the one who paid extra just to lie in silence and hold hands, the one who recited Greek myths mid-session, boring Greek myths. And no, he didn't do voices. Did women laugh at them behind closed doors? Sometimes. Yes, but they also pitied them, understood them, occasionally even liked them, because once the theatrics were stripped away, what remained were just people, flawed, fumbling, full of weird habits and soft spots. Some clients fancied themselves saviors. They'd offer to rescue a girl, whisk her away to some imagined countryside life full of tulips and moral redemption. A few minutes, most didn't, and the women had a saying for them. Men who write endings they won't live. There was one famous case of a client who married a brothel worker and opened a shop with her. They lasted 3 years, and according to surviving receipts, sold mostly umbrellas and cough drops. Historians still debate whether that counts as a success. Honestly, it sounds kind of sweet. And then there were the ones who disappeared. They came once, were kind, or strange, or forgettable, and then never came back. No explanation. Just gone. Some women didn't notice, others did, and wondered, was he ashamed, sick, married, dead? The brothel didn't ask. The next knock was always just around the corner. One particularly thoughtful girl used to write fictional backstories for her favorite clients. The gruff tailor became a secret poet. The banker was actually a spy. The man with the monocle, definitely a pirate. It wasn't about romance, it was about reclaiming the narrative, making the stories hers. From a historical lens, clients are often either ignored or demonized. But the truth is, messier. Some were kind, some were cruel, most were just complicated products of the same society that shaped the women they visited. They were trapped, too, in their own expectations and secrets. Did the women love them? Rarely. Did they learn from them? Often. Did they survive them? Always. And that's the interesting part, because even though the men paid for control, it was the women who held the real power in it, just over the room, or the moment, but over the story. They decided which clients were remembered, and how. They built an oral history passed down between shifts, like folk tales with corsets and caution. So next time you think about a Victorian brothel, don't just picture the furniture, picture the little moments. The way a woman like Elsie looked up at a man and instantly knew if she needed to fake a smile or genuinely grin. The way Dora could tell from a man's knock what kind of night it would be. The way laughter floated down the hall when someone tried too hard to impress with friends they clearly didn't understand. Because for every man who walked in thinking he was in charge, there was a woman waiting who already knew how the evening would end. Let's linger now on a role that was both revered and feared within the brothel's walls. Madam, she wasn't a worker, she wasn't a client, she was something in between: a gatekeeper, a boss, a surrogate mother, and, occasionally, a benevolent dictator with a great taste in shawls. The madam ran the show. She set the rules, handled the money, and made sure that the whole house didn't fall into chaos. In many ways, She was the ultimate survivor. Most had once worked in the trade themselves and clawed their way into management through a combination of charm, cunning, and knowing exactly when to raise an eyebrow. Now, not all madams were created equal. Some were strict but fair, running their houses with military precision. No men without payment. No drinking before 6 p.m. And if you break the chamber pot again, you're cleaning it with your bloomers. That kind of vibe. Others were softer, more motherly, offering advice over tea and warning you gently when a client looked a bit too excited to be polite. And then there were the harsh honesty women, who saw the brothel less as a home and more as a factory. They took large cuts, enforced brutal schedules, and expected loyalty without giving much in return. Elsie once said that madams like those wore perfume and poison in the same bottle. You never quite knew which one you were getting, but no matter the personality, the job was the same. Keep the business running. That meant everything from handling the landlord who always knew exactly what kind of house he was renting but pretended otherwise, to smoothing over disputes between workers, clients, and occasionally the law. A good madam was part politician, part accountant, part therapist. She remembered birthdays, blacklisted bad clients, and knew when a girl needed a night off. Even if the girl didn't ask, she might scold you for being late, but she'd also slip you an extra coin if you were short on laundry money. Most importantly, the madam protected her girls at least in the better houses. If a client got rough, she was the first to intervene. If rumors started flying, she knew how to quash them. One woman reportedly faced down a constable by quoting Queen Victoria's own remarks about the dignity of a woman's choice, though whether the Queen ever said it is very much debated. Didn't matter, it worked. Interestingly, many madams cultivated an air of mystery. They didn't share their pasts. They went by nicknames like Miss May, Madame Rose, or just Ma. One girl claimed her madam used to be an opera singer. Another swore she was once a spy. The truth, probably somewhere between a theater usher and a landlady with good posture. What we do know is that madams kept secrets. Lots of them. They had ledgers full of fake names, debts, schedules, and discreet notes like "do not book Thursday's coughing." Some even kept little favors from important men letters, rings, bits of information they could trade if things ever turned sour. And while many think of madams as older women, some were surprisingly young, barely out of their 20s, already veterans of the trade, already tired of pretending to enjoy small talk about shipping prices. Age wasn't what made a madam, it was presence, the ability to walk into a room and make everyone sit up straighter without raising her voice. Some madams tried to legitimize their work. They kept tidy books, paid hush fees to local constables, and even made quiet donations to church, just how no one talked about where the money came from. A few helped their girls leave the trade when they were ready. One reportedly gave parting gifts, a mirror, a handkerchief, and a hard truth. But of course, not all madams were noble. Some were exploitative. Some took advantage of desperation. Some turned a blind eye when they shouldn't have. The brothel business was murky, and power could be misused, especially when there was no one to hold them accountable. Still, the madam held the center. Without her, the place didn't function. She answered the knocks, negotiated with vendors, and ensured the candles didn't run out mid-shift. She organized medical visits, managed who saw which clients, and sometimes tucked a girl into bed with a cup of honey tea and a whisper, "Tomorrow will be better." We don't have statues for these women, no plaques or public honors, but if you read enough old court records, personal diaries, and whispered histories, you find traces of them, their names inked in the margins, their voices remembered in how rules were written. One former worker described her madam as the only woman who ever called me by my real name and meant it. That says a lot. So next time you imagine a Victorian brothel, picture not just the soft lighting and the silken robes, but the woman in the back room, counting coins, adjusting rosters, and staring down a man twice her size because he didn't say please. The madam wasn't a saint, but she was, in many ways, the spine of it all. We've come a long way, haven't we? From the clink of teacups in shared bedrooms to the distant sound of horse hoofs echoing off faulty cobblestones. But before we ease toward rest, let's spend a moment with something less concrete, more delicate, and often missing from the archives, how Victorian brothel workers saw themselves. Because beyond all the love bells fallen women, scarlet ladies, sinners, survivors, there were human beings looking in mirrors, tying ribbons, wondering what it meant to be them, and that inner voice, that self-perception, it didn't always line up with what the world said about them. Take Elsie again. She wasn't just a girl at number 14. She was someone who had favorite earrings one missing a stone, a strong opinion about how tea should be brewed never too weak, and an ongoing disagreement with Dora about whether birds could feel envy. That's the thing, these women had interior lives, even if society tried to flatten them into symbols. They were three-dimensional where it counted. Some saw their work as practical. It's a job, they'd say, same as washing sheets or serving stew. Others carried shame, tucked away under corsets and clever smiles. And some swung wildly between the two, depending on the day, the client, or how many hours of sleep they'd had. Religious guilt loomed large. The Victorian era loved a good sermon, and many girls had been raised with fire and brimstone ideas. Some avoided churches entirely, others attended in disguise, and some, in the strangest contradiction of all, prayed every night, sometimes for forgiveness, sometimes just for fewer blisters. But even guilt wasn't straightforward. Many women, over time, built their own moral codes. Don't steal from each other. Don't let a client insult the new girl. Don't pretend to like poetry if you don't. These small principles acted like anchors ways to stay themselves in a life full of roles and expectations. And you know what? Some felt pride. Real, sharp, unexpected pride. Not in what they had to do, but in how well they managed it. In their ability to stay safe, to spot a lie, to handle a drunk client without breaking a nail or a teacup. One diary entry simply reads, "I wore red today, and I liked how I looked in it." Not every woman in this world was downtrodden. Not every moment was a struggle. There was laughter deep, cackling, belly laughs that made the walls shake. There was affection, unspoken alliances, fierce loyalty, and even the occasional love letter passed between rooms when no one was looking. They gave each other nicknames, threw small birthday surprises, made up songs about their least favorite clients. In those acts, they weren't victims or statistics. They were just people, trying to carve softness into a life that didn't offer much. And some women became mentors, not officially, of course, but when a new girl arrived, confused and pale, there was always someone to show her the ropes. Use this powder, not that. Don't trust the man with the cane who talks about his Eileen wife. It's okay to cry, but do it in the bath, not the hallway. That passed on wisdom. That's legacy. So how did they see themselves? Maybe the better question is, how did they want to be seen? Not as ruined, not as dirty, not as exotic creatures in a scandalous novel, but as women who made choices, sometimes bad ones, sometimes necessary ones, always human ones. Some hoped to disappear quietly, to start anew somewhere else. Others wanted to be remembered, not pitied, and a few, just a few, wrote their names in books and letters and walls, saying, "I was here, I lived, I mattered." One faint note, found under a loose floorboard in an old London brothel, reads, "They called me many names, but none of them were mine. My real name is Margaret. I liked cats. I had a sister once." Tell someone. We're telling Margaret. So tonight, as we close this chapter, we're not just looking at scandalous footnotes or moral cautionary tales. We're remembering people with freckles and dreams and chipped fingernails, people who lived between the lines of judgment and survival, making space for themselves in a world that rarely offered it. They weren't perfect, they weren't saints, but they were alive and complicated and clever and so much more than their profession. And now, as promised, you've made it all the way to the end. Good on you. That was a lot of corsets, candles, and complicated feelings to drift through. Now, let's slow everything down. Let the words start to dissolve a little, like sugar in warm tea. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Picture a small room, quiet and soft. A window just cracked open, letting in a breeze. A creaky chair, a half-read book, the whisper of old stories gently fading into sleep. You're not in Victorian London anymore. You're right here, safe, still, breathing slowly. The gas lamps have all gone out. The doors are closed. Everyone's gone quiet. Nothing to prove. No one to impress. Just you and your breath. And maybe a little echo of Elsie humming a lullaby from the hallway. Sleep well.